Okay, so it is time to do pages 3 and 4 of your study guide, and I have the screencast set up to help you. What it's going to do is it's going to read the textbook to you, and it's going to actually highlight your fill in the blank answers. So, what that will look like is as you're reading through the page with the textbook, when it gets to an answer like American Expeditionary Force, it will highlight that answer for you. And if you need a second to write it down, you can pause the screencast and write the answer down or type it in. So you just have to follow along as it reads out loud for you. And while I get that started, this is the page it's going to start on in the textbook. There are no answers on this page. So it just takes a second. It'll read through this. And by the time you get to the next page, you're going to hear some answers. So let me set that up. If you've never had the audio read to you before, you would click on the arrow here, section audio, and then you would hit play.
Section 3, Americans in World War I.
If you were there. It is April 1918. You are marching into Paris with your army unit on your way to the front lines. Women and children throw flowers from windows and balconies as you pass through the city. You want to do whatever it takes to defend this city and its residents. You know that defeating Germany will be difficult and very dangerous. Do you think American forces can help the Allies win the war?
Building background. Preparations for war helped make the United States a strong military power. By 1918, nearly 5 million Americans were serving in the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. While this huge armed force was being trained, however, the fighting in Europe was going badly for the Allies. French and British leaders were eager for help from America. American soldiers arrive. By the time U.S. troops started to arrive in Europe in 1917, the Allies were dangerously near defeat. German forces were advancing in France, once again driving toward Paris. The German Navy was destroying Allied ships at sea, and on the Eastern Front, the Russians were desperately struggling to hold back the Germans. Joining the fight. French and British generals called for immediate help on the front lines. They wanted the U.S. troops, known as the American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, to join French and British units. But General John J. Pershing, leader of the American troops, insisted that the Americans join the fight as a separate force. He refused to have the AEF scattered among the Allied forces where it will not be an American army at all. Pershing also demanded that his troops be thoroughly trained for combat before rushing to the front lines. The AEF included many well-trained regular Army and National Guard troops, but it also included a large number of inexperienced volunteers and draftees. Pershing gave the men 3 months of intense training in Army discipline and trench warfare. He believed that taking the time to train his soldiers would help the Allies achieve victory. Russia leaves the war. While Pershing trained his troops, the Allies' position became even more dangerous. In November 1917, a group of Russians called the Bolsheviks overthrew the Russian government and seized power. The Bolsheviks were communists, people who favored the equal distribution of wealth and the end of all forms of private property. Led by Vladimir Lenin, the new Russian government faced a desperate situation. Around 8 million Russians had been killed or wounded during the war. Soldiers were deserting from the Eastern Front, and sailors were leaving naval bases. Food riots raged in the cities. The Russians could not keep fighting under these conditions. In March 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, a peace agreement with the Central Powers. A civil war then broke out in Russia between the communists and forces loyal to the Tsar, Russia's emperor. The United States and other Allied countries sent aid to the Tsarist forces. Russia, however, one of the main Allied powers, was out of World War I. Winning the war. With Russia out of the fighting, German generals saw a chance to win the war. In the spring of 1918, Germany transferred many of its divisions of troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. Germany planned to smash the stalemate. The final battles. At the same time, American soldiers arrived. Even training had not prepared them for the realities of war. The troops lived on dried beef, hard biscuits, and canned emergency rations. The men shared the trenches with rats, lice, and sometimes the bodies of dead soldiers. A soldier's song of the time described the situation. Sing me to sleep where bullets fall. Let me forget the war and all. Damp is my dugout, or trench, cold my feet. Nothing but bully or canned meat and biscuits to eat. Quoted in Great Push, an episode of the Great War by Patrick McGill. On March 21st, 1918, the Germans began blasting more than 6,000 heavy guns at Allied troops along the Somme River in northern France. German forces drove 40 miles into Allied lines before the advance stalled. Some 250,000 Germans had been killed or wounded. British and French casualties totaled 133,000. The Germans then attacked farther south, advancing to the Marne River and pushing the French line back toward Paris. At this critical moment, General Pershing promised Allied Commander Ferdinand Foch, infantry, artillery, aviation, all that we have. The American people would be proud to be engaged in the greatest battle of history. 2 divisions of the AEF joined French forces. The Germans were unprepared for the fresh energy and fighting skills of the Americans. The U.S. soldiers succeeded in stopping the German advance less than 50 miles from Paris. Then, at Belleau Wood, the Allies attacked and gradually drove the Germans back. German generals became desperate. In July 1918, they launched their final offensive, one last attempt to cross the Marne River. Terrible losses on the German side stopped the German offensive and protected Paris from invasion. Although they suffered about 12,000 casualties, American troops had helped force a major turning point in the war. Driving the Germans back. Now the Allies drove toward victory. There were more than 1 million U.S. troops in France, and they played a key role in the later battles of the war. In September 1918, Allied forces attacked and defeated the Germans at the town of Saint-Mihiel, on the border of France and Germany. Along the Meuse River and in the Argonne Forest near the French-Belgian border, American and Allied troops again attacked German forces. Among the many heroes of these battles was a young man from Tennessee named Alvin York. In October 1918, York killed 25 German gunners and captured 132 prisoners. His heroism earned him fame and many awards, including the Congressional Medal of Honor. His life story even became the basis for a popular movie in 1941. Also among the brave American troops were the African American soldiers of the 369th Infantry. Known as the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th spent more time in combat than any other American unit. Its members were the first to reach the Rhine River on the German border. France awarded them the prized Croix de Guerre, or Cross of War medal, for their bravery. The Allies were also winning the war at sea. Allied war planners used a new strategy called the convoy system to protect their ships. This meant that destroyers capable of sinking U-boats escorted and protected groups of Allied merchant ships. By November 1918, American soldiers were making rapid advances toward Germany. For the first time, the enemy lines were completely broken through, reported General Pershing. Armistice. At home and on the battlefield, Germans were tired of war. Food was so scarce in Germany that more than 800 German civilians were dying of starvation every day. In Germany and other nations of the Central Powers, food riots and strikes occurred. Germany was also running out of soldiers. In addition to those killed or wounded in 1918, 1/4 of Germany's fighting men had been captured by the Allies. Germany's allies were also eager to end the war. Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire quit the war in the fall of 1918. Austria-Hungary reached a peace agreement with the Allies on November 3rd. Seeing that his country was beaten, the German leader, Kaiser Wilhelm II, gave up his throne and fled to the Netherlands. The Germans then agreed to a ceasefire. The Allies demanded that Germany pull back from all its conquered territory. They insisted that Germany destroy its aircraft, tanks, and big guns, and surrender its U-boats. The Germans had no choice but to accept these demands to disarm. The armistice, or truce, went into effect on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. At 11 o'clock, everything got so quiet that the silence was nearly unbearable, remembered an American soldier. Then, the silence was broken with shouts like, "I've lived through the war." Summary and preview. America's entry in World War I. Next session, you will learn about the after